an unprecedented and precarious moment in American history. Daily, the president shocks our conscience and shakes the very foundations of our democracy using a powerful megaphone, social media. The president has used this megaphone to spread vicious falsehoods in an apparent attempt to overturn the will of voters. Every day, he posts new threats and conspiracy theories about mail-in ballots and voting machines, lies that contradict his own election security officials and his lawyers. He uses this megaphone potentially to block a peaceful transition of power. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, you have built terrifying tools of persuasion and manipulation with power far exceeding the robber barons of the last Gilded Age. You have profited hugely by strip mining data about our private lives and promoting hate speech and voter suppression. You have an immense civic and moral responsibility to ensure these instruments of influence do not irreparably harm our country. I recognize the steps, they're really baby steps, that you've taken so far. The destructive, incendiary misinformation is still a scourge on both your platforms and on others. In fact, Google has been given a pass from today's hearing. It's been rewarded by this committee for its timidity, doing even less than you have done to live up to its responsibilities. The recent actions you have taken, in fact, are simply to check the truth of what appears on platforms. Often it is voter suppression and incendiary, malicious misinformation, and you've tried to slow its insidious spread. That's not censorship. That's moral and civic responsibility. Now, I believe, and I hope the chairman agrees, that a series of hearings on big tech is long overdue on antitrust issues, on privacy concerns, and Section 230. I have urged, in fact, a breakup of tech giants because they've misused their bigness and power. Breaking off, for example, WhatsApp and Instagram. Rigorous privacy protection, because consumers should have control over their own data. And indeed, Section 230 reform, meaningful reform, including even possible repeal in large part, because their immunity is way too broad, and victims of their harms deserve a day in court. But this hearing is certainly not the serious proceeding that we need. It may become a political sideshow, a public tar and feathering. My colleagues seem to want to ignore the foreign disinformation campaigns intended to interfere in our democracy and calls for murder of FBI Director Wray and Dr. Fauci. What we've seen here are fighting words and hate speech that certainly deserve no free expression protection. The fact is that the purpose of today's hearing seems as much to bully or browbeat you, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, from taking even more responsible action by threatening cuts to Section 230. Censorship is really a misnomer for this hearing. What you've done is to label and to fact check, to avoid amplifying misinformation, and to, in effect, impose those labels to alert people that what they are consuming may misinform them. And Facebook took down ads for Biden in Michigan and the ACLU in Colorado for mistaken information about voting. In short, there was action that affected both sides. I have fought for Section 230 reform for 16 years, from my time as Connecticut's Attorney General when I took on the scourge of registered sex offenders grooming children on Facebook and MySpace with Senator Portman. I have led passage of the only successful revision so far to Section 230, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, known as SESTA, and Chairman Graham and I have authored the only bill to reform Section 230 that is actually moved out of a committee. This section, the Earn It Act, passed this committee unanimously. Change is going to come, no question. Change is on the way, and I intend to bring aggressive and targeted reform to Section 230. But I am not, nor should we be on this committee, interested in being a member of the speech police. There are real harms and real victims here. And in some ways, this hearing is a betrayal of those real harms and the real victims of them. Those harms have been caused by big tech because you have failed your responsibility, as have others in this industry. I want to see real reform that will enable these abuses to be reformed, because your platforms have embraced, abused, and weaponized child predators, violent white supremacists, and human traffickers. And I've heard heart-wrenching stories from the victims. You've set back civil rights protections for Muslim Americans who live in fear of armed militias, organized by private online groups. You have set back consumers and competition, making that kind of antitrust action very, very important. The American public deserves and demands real reform and accountability, national consumer privacy rules, antitrust principles that curb predatory power, and reforms to Section 230 that stop shutting the courthouse door to victims. I look forward to an opportunity for real change, and I think you can meet this moment by putting your power and your money on the right side of history. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Lot to unpack there. Senator Blumenthal's been great to work with. I'll continue to work with you. If we keep control of the committee, Senator Grassley would be the chairman next year, and I would encourage him to have the hearings that Senator Blumenthal referenced, that this is an ongoing conversation to get it right to the extent that we can get it right. Mr. Dorsey from Twitter, are you with us, Mr. Dorsey?
I am. You hear me?
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you to the members of the Judiciary Committee for the opportunity to speak with the American people about Twitter and your concerns around censorship and suppression of a specific news article, and generally what we saw in the 2020 U.S. elections conversation. We were called here today because of an enforcement decision we made against the New York Post based on a policy we created in 2018 to prevent Twitter from being used to spread hacked materials. This resulted in us blocking people from sharing a New York Post article, publicly or privately. We made a quick interpretation, using no other evidence, that the materials in the article were obtained through hacking, and according to our policy, we blocked them from being spread. Upon further consideration, we admitted this action was wrong and corrected it within 24 hours. We informed the New York Post of our error and policy update and how to unlock their account by deleting the original violating tweet, which freed them to tweet the exact same content and news article again. They chose not to, instead insisting we reverse our enforcement action. We did not have a practice around retroactively overturning prior enforcements. This incident demonstrated that we needed one, and so we created one we believe is fair and appropriate. I hope this illustrates the rationale behind our actions and demonstrates our ability to take feedback, admit mistakes, and make changes, all transparently to the public. We acknowledge there are still concerns around how we moderate content, and specifically our use of Section 230. 3 weeks ago, we proposed 3 solutions to address the concerns raised, and they all focus on services that decide to moderate or remove content. It could be expansions to Section 230, new legislative frameworks, or a commitment to industry-wide self-regulation best practices, requiring 1, moderation process and practices to be published, 2, a straightforward process to appeal decisions, and 3, best efforts around algorithmic choice are suggestions to address the concerns we all have going forward. And they're all achievable in short order. It's critical as we consider these solutions, we optimize for new startups and independent developers. Doing so ensures a level playing field that increases the probability of competing ideas to help solve problems going forward. We mustn't entrench the largest companies any further. Finally, before I close, I wanted to share some reflections on what we saw during the US presidential election. We focused on addressing attempts to undermine civic integrity, providing informative context, and product changes to encourage greater conversation. We updated our civic integrity policy to address misleading or disputed information that undermines confidence in the election, causes voter intimidation or suppression or confusion about how to vote, or misrepresents affiliation or election outcomes. More than a year ago, the public asked us to offer additional context to help make potentially misleading information more apparent. We did exactly that, applying labels to over 300,000 tweets from October 27th to November 11th, which represented about 2.2% of all US election-related tweets. We also changed how our product works in order to help increase context and encourage more thoughtful consideration before tweets are shared broadly. We're continuing to assess the impact of these product changes to inform our long-term roadmap. So thank you for the time. I look forward to a productive discussion focused on solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Thank you, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Blumenthal, and members of the committee. At last month's hearing, I spoke about the role internet platforms play in supporting democracy, keeping people safe, and upholding fundamental values like free expression. People have deeply held beliefs about these issues and can reach very different conclusions about the right balance. We try to do what's best for our community and the world, acknowledging that there are difficult trade-offs. I believe that some of these trade-offs and decisions would be better made through a democratic process, and I look forward to discussing that today. But first, I want to update you on our efforts during the election. At Facebook, we took our responsibility to protect the integrity of this election very seriously. In 2016, we began to face new kinds of threats, and after years of preparation, we were ready to defend against them. We've built sophisticated systems to protect against election interference that combine artificial intelligence, significant human review, and partnerships with the intelligence community, law enforcement, and other tech platforms. We've taken down more than 100 networks of bad actors who are trying to coordinate and interfere globally. We established a network of independent fact-checkers that covers more than 60 languages. We made political advertising more transparent on Facebook than anywhere else, and including TV, radio, and email. And we introduced new policies to combat voter suppression and misinformation. Still, the pandemic created new challenges: how to handle misinformation about COVID and voting by mail, how to prepare people for the reality that results would take time, and how to handle if someone prematurely declared victory or refused to accept the result. So in September, we updated our policies again to reflect these realities of voting in 2020 and make sure that we were taking precautions given these unique circumstances. We worked with local election officials to remove false claims about polling conditions that might lead to voter suppression. We partnered with Reuters and the National Election Pool to provide reliable information about results. We attached voting information to posts by candidates on both sides and additional contexts to posts trying to delegitimize the outcome. We locked down new political ads in the week before the election to prevent misleading claims from spreading when they couldn't be rebutted. We strengthened our enforcement against militias and conspiracy networks like QAnon to prevent them from using our platforms to organize violence or civil unrest. Altogether, I believe this was the largest election integrity effort by any private company in recent times. This is what people expect of us. And I'm glad that from what we've seen so far, our systems performed well. But election interference remains an ongoing threat that will never fully be solved. So we continue to improve with each election. But our integrity work is really only half the story. We also ran an unprecedented civic engagement program to encourage people to take part in our democracy. We ran the largest voter information campaign in history. 140 million people visited our voting information center, including more than 33 million on election day alone. We estimate that we helped more than 4.5 million people register to vote and helped states recruit 100,000 poll workers. This was done in a transparent and nonpartisan way as part of our ongoing commitment to supporting the civic process. And on top of these efforts by Facebook, my wife Priscilla and I personally donated $400 million to support election officials around the country in making sure that they had the infrastructure they needed to enable everyone to vote safely during this pandemic. In my last testimony, I said that people would judge us by our performance during this election. And I believe that the full story is not only how we handled bad behavior on our platforms, but also how we encouraged civic engagement more broadly. I'm proud of the work we've done to support our democracy, and I look forward to discussing this. I also welcome the opportunity to discuss internet regulation. I believe we are well overdue to update the rules for the internet around content, elections, privacy, and data portability. There are important questions here, including who should be responsible for what people say online. For any system to work, I believe there needs to be a transparent process that people feel they can trust. And this will be difficult, especially since our country is so divided, but I believe it's the only way to address these issues for the long term. The challenges that we face are deeper than any one platform. They're about how we want to balance basic social equities that we all care about, like free expression, public safety, and privacy. This is why I believe we would benefit from clearer guidance from elected officials, and I look forward to discussing this today.
Well, thank you both. We'll have one round and 7 minutes, but I'll, as always, try to be a little bit liberal with the time because it's a very important topic. So let's just get right into it. Mr. Dorsey, you can go first, then Mr. Zuckerberg. When you heard Senator Blumenthal's opening statement and mine, what did you get from it?
Well, I think you pointed out that we are facing something that feels impossible. We are required to help increase the health of the public conversation, while at the same time ensuring that as many people as possible can participate. And in order to do so, we need to make policies so that people feel safe and they feel free to express themselves, to minimize threats of abuse, of harassment, of misleading information, of organized campaigns to artificially amplify or influence a particular conversation. And that policy creation, that enforcement is challenging, but also it is more or less opaque to the public. And that's where I think we have a gap. We have transparency around our policies. We do not have transparency around how we operate content moderation, the rationale behind it, the reasoning. And as we look forward, we have more and more of our decisions, of our operations, moving to algorithms, which have a difficult time explaining why they make decisions, bringing transparency around those decisions. And that is why we believe that we should have more choice in how these algorithms are applied to our content, whether we use them at all, so we can turn them on or off, and have clarity around the outcomes that they are projecting and how they affect our experience.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, very quickly, please. What did you hear?
Senator, I heard that there are issues around content moderation, as well as other areas. And frankly, I'm optimistic from the statements that we may be able to move forward and hopefully update some of the rules for the internet around these areas. I've been encouraging and hoping that we would do this for a couple of years. And from your opening statements, it sounds like there may be now enough common ground on views that real progress can be made here.
So from my point of view, the question for us is, when it comes time to flag content as being reliable or not reliable, Do either one of you believe that the government should do that? Is that a solution where the government sets a regulatory scheme that talks about what should be up and what should be down?
I don't believe so. I think that would be very challenging.
Okay. Do you agree with that, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, for certain types of illegal content, I think it may be appropriate for there to be clear rules around that. But outside of clear harms, including things like child exploitation in areas like that, terrorism, I would agree with your sentiment that that's not something that government should be deciding on a piece of content by piece of content basis.
So if we take the government out of the picture, at least in non-criminal areas, should we leave it up to the industry to come up with best business practices in terms of how to moderate content?
I think that's best. I think we need to align around the problem that we're trying to solve. And there are many solutions to solving those problems, but I think we also have to focus our efforts on what is going to have the greatest impact. And we believe that the greatest impact is going to be found in how we deal with algorithms, how we use those algorithms, because they are responsible for showing us what we see or what we don't see. And there needs to be more choice in their use.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, I think that there is a role for regulation in the process, even if not defining on a piece of content by piece of content basis. And one of the areas that I've advocated for is regulation around transparency that goes beyond just about what the policies are and what the process is, but also goes towards results. And as an example of this, every quarter, Facebook releases a community standards enforcement report. It's basically a transparency report that breaks down each category of potentially harmful content that we track, ranging from terrorism to child exploitation content to incitement of violence to pornography to intellectual property violations.
Yes, if I may, I don't mean to interrupt, but who sets those community standards? How are they set by the company?
Senator, we have a policy team that consults with a number of different stakeholders and outside groups to make sure that we're getting feedback from broad swaths of our community covering all of the concerns.
Is that publicly known?
Senator, I believe so. And our head of content policy has testified publicly multiple times.
Okay. So when it comes to fact checking, would you give us a list of the people you use to fact check?
Senator, yes. Okay. We work with a number of independent organizations that are accredited by the Poynter Institute, and they include Reuters, the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, United States, USA Today, factcheck.org, Science Feedback, PolitiFact, Check Your Fact, Lead Stories, and The Dispatch in the United States.
Okay, I think it's important for the public to know who sets community standards, how they're set, who does the fact checking, who you rely upon to do that. I think that would go a long way to people having a better understanding of the decisions you make. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe your product can be addictive?
Senator, we certainly do not design the product in that way. We design the product to be as useful and meaningful as possible.
That's not my question. My question is that there seems to be an ample body of growing medical evidence that social media sites have an addictive nature to them. Do you agree with that?
Senator, I don't think the research has been conclusive, but it is an area that we care about and study. We certainly do not want our products to be addictive. We want people to use them because they are meaningful. And we take steps to make sure that this is the case. So, for example, we don't give the team that's running Newsfeed a goal around how much time people spend on our products, which goes counter to a lot of the memes and misinformation out there around how we operate. But My goal is to help people connect and find content and interactions that are going to be meaningful to them on our service. And our view is that if that's what we deliver over the long term and people find the services useful, then they'll use them more. But I don't think that companies should be optimizing to just encourage people to spend as much time as possible on them.
Well, time's about up. Have you seen the movie Social Dilemma?
Senator, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, have you seen it, Mr. Dorsey?
No, I have not.
I would encourage both of you to see it. So here's what I think we're going to do on the committee over time, I hope, is to ask the question more directly, are these social media sites addictive? Do they have a public health component that needs to be addressed? For years, we thought tobacco was a great thing. We found out tobacco was not such a great thing. The medical science around these websites are becoming very concerning to me, particularly among children, and that you can manipulate how many times you watch. And you can set these media sites up so that people will constantly interact. So to both of you, I appreciate coming before the committee. We've got a long way to go. I don't think the government needs to regulate what we think or what we say, but we've got to up our game here. And I'll end with this last question. Do both of you support change to 230, reform of Section 230?
Senator, I do.
Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me bring this down to very practical terms. We're in the middle of another election. This election in Georgia could determine, in fact, which party controls the United States Senate. I'm concerned that both of your companies are, in fact, backsliding or retrenching, that you are failing to take action against dangerous disinformation, exactly the same kind of voter suppression tactics that existed in the last election, and that you are, in fact, reducing content modification. The fighting words and hate speech in the last election could inflame violence and send poll workers into hiding, discourage people from coming to the polls. We have to expect the same kinds of malign tactics. In fact, they are already visible, and I'm going to ask, Mr. Chairman, that these posts and tweets be entered into the record, if there's no objection, that are aimed at delegitimizing the election in January. My question to you is, will you commit to the same kind of robust content modification playbook in this coming election, including fact-checking, labeling, reducing the spread of misinformation, and other steps, even for politicians, in the runoff elections ahead?
Senator, our policy is to have a similar approach in the upcoming Georgia special elections that we took during the general election.
Mr. Dorsey?
Yes, we do. We intend to learn from all of our experience with this election and bring all that learning going forward to make it more robust.
During the past election, there was rampant disinformation on social media in Spanish-speaking sites, repeating QAnon conspiracies and false claims of election rigging. In my view, you need to do better. Will you commit to taking steps to improve content modification for Spanish-speaking communities before the Georgia runoff?
Senator, this is something that we are already working on and worked on ahead of the general election. We have multiple fact checkers who focus on the Spanish as a language, and we made sure that we translated our voter information center into Spanish, which we showed at the top of Facebook and Instagram to everyone who uses those products. in Spanish in the US. Those are a couple of the steps that we've taken, and we're certainly committed to focusing on this.
And yes, we will, in partnership with Latinx civil rights groups.
I'd like to know, and perhaps you could submit to me within 1 week, what additional steps you're going to take, because this Georgia runoff is underway. And as I've indicated, I've seen a backsliding and retrenchment that is very deeply troubling, that have enabled the spread of this disinformation, the restarting of certain algorithms, for example, that promote or amplify misinformation is very, very troubling. And I think I want to know within a week what additional steps we're taking to enhance the efforts to stop this kind of amplification and spread. Let me ask about Facebook community standards, which ban language that, quote, incites or facilitates serious violence. As you know, on November 5th, Steve Bannon, in a Facebook Live video, called for beheadings of Dr. Fauci and FBI Director Wray for not acting more favorably toward President Trump. Twitter banned Bannon for these remarks. You removed the video, Mr. Zuckerberg, but on Thursday, you reportedly told Facebook employees that Bannon had not violated enough policies that he should be banned from Facebook. My question to you is, how many times has Steve Bannon allowed the call for the murder of government officials before Facebook suspends his account?
Senator, as you say, the content in question did violate our policies, and we took it down. Having a content violation does not automatically mean your account gets taken down, and the number of strikes varies depending on the type of offense. So if people are posting terrorist content or child exploitation content, then the first time that they do it, then we will take down their account. For other things, it's multiple. I'd be happy to follow up afterwards. We try not to disclose these.
Down his account?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Will you commit to taking down that account, Steve Bannon's account?
Senator, no, that's not what our policies would suggest that we should do in this case.
According to the internal records that are on the record now, leaked by NBC News, Facebook has removed fact checks and forgiven infractions for conservative pages and pundits such as Breitbart, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, and Gateway Pundit, based on a fear of accusations of bias. Has Facebook avoided penalizing or fact-checking conservative pages that had violated its policies based on concerns of political bias and allegations of bias?
Senator, no, we haven't done that. And I think that those reports mischaracterize the actions that we take. I'm not aware of any instance where we have overturned a fact check specifically. And certainly no action like that would be taken for the reasons that you're saying. What we do sometimes is apply some judgment on whether the repeat offender policies would render too harsh of a penalty, but that's different from overturning a specific fact check, and is not done for the reasons that you said.
Well, I'm very concerned that, in fact, Facebook seems to have a record of making accommodations and caving to conservative pressure, and the president has tried to use an executive order on Section 230 to again bully or browbeat and exert pressure on you and others in this industry. They're, in effect, working the refs, and they're winning. Let me ask you about antitrust issues. In 2013, Facebook bought Onavo, which is a virtual private records network that claimed to protect users' privacy. In fact, Onavo's access to private information about its users provided Facebook with unparalleled ability to track potential competition. I want to know whether Facebook used data from Onavo when it decided to purchase WhatsApp in 2014.
Senator, I believe that data from Onavo was one of the sources that the team looked at, but I don't think it would have taken using Onavo to understand that WhatsApp was a great product. And I don't think that was determinative in my decision to pursue that.
Well, in fact, the House antitrust report says Onavo data was used to determine whether WhatsApp was, quote, killing Facebook Messenger, end quote. My time has almost expired, but let me just say finally that antitrust action by the Federal Trade Commission is long overdue. I believe that decisive action is necessary, including very likely breaking up Facebook as a remedy. All options ought to be on the table, including divestment of Instagram and WhatsApp. The FTC ought to impose strict conditions on how Facebook uses consumer data and competes with rivals, because the abuse of competition must end. Mr. Chairman, I ask that 3 letters from civil rights groups regarding disinformation and hate speech on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and also a letter from a coalition of children's protection advocates on the Earn It Act and child sexual abuse material on digital platforms be entered into the record. Thank you both for being here today.
Without objection, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm glad to hear both of our witnesses today say that Section 230, that they are open to reform, because I think it's fair to say the internet has outgrown Section 230. And while we've made some modifications when it comes to terrorism and when it comes to child exploitation, I think there's more to do. But I think the question is going to be how this regulation is going to come to pass. I know there's some, including on this committee, who suggest that maybe we ought to create a private right of action so that individuals can sue over claims of violated rights on your platforms. I think that's one form of regulation. It's called regulation by litigation, but it's certainly not my first choice, and it's not optimal. And I don't think it's something we ought to be embracing in the first instance. But I do think it's critical that each of you and your counterparts work with us to try to come up with something that will address the concerns. And the basic concern I have is it's hard to know exactly how to classify your business model. It's we have a provision in the Bill of Rights protecting freedom of the press, but yet here, while we would never let the government regulate what the press writes or doesn't write, essentially we are allowing private companies, which are now de facto public forums, to regulate that speech. And I'm no more comfortable delegating those decisions to you than I am delegating to you my vote in the last or upcoming elections. You know, Louis Brandeis famously said that the solution for bad speech is not less speech, it's more speech. And it seems to me like the practices that you are engaging in to tag, remove, and otherwise censor speech on your platforms violates that principle. And I'd like to know why that shouldn't be a better approach by allowing more speech rather than censoring what is perceived as bad speech. And then, as I think I've discussed with you, Mr. Zuckerberg, I think we're all sort of struggling to come up with what the appropriate analogy here is to your business model. We know as as newspapers have become less profitable and many of them gone out of business, there's been consolidation in the news media. There is a proliferation of cable TV shows and people being able to get information through a variety of sources, but there's no Walter Cronkite or the big TV networks that with the trusted anchor person who people have confidence in, that they will shoot with them straight. And so I know it's a very difficult thing to manage, but I would just encourage both of you not to wait for the lawsuits. We saw what happened to Microsoft. I think Bill Gates said that was one of his biggest mistakes, failing to engage with some of the antitrust concerns when it came to Microsoft, and he learned that the hard way. And I think there is a better way for the American people, and that's if we work on this together. Mr. Zuckerberg, I believe that Facebook publishes on a quarterly basis a report of its actions in this area. Is that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
And could you describe that for us and what motivated you to undertake that sort of transparency?
Yes. Senator, I believe that in order for people to trust that we're doing a good job, they have to be able to see the results. And we have to be able to break down on a content on a kind of category by category basis across all the different categories of harm, whether it's terrorist content or child exploitation or incitement of violence or pornography or intellectual property violations, how much of the violating content is on our platforms and how effective our systems are at removing it. And what we hold ourselves accountable towards is getting as high a percent of this harmful content down, addressing it, before real people have to experience it and report it to us themselves. So in categories where we do quite well, for example, in fighting against terrorist content, our AI systems and counterterrorism teams are able to remove 98 or 99% of that harmful content before anyone has to report it to us. In other categories, it's more challenging and we're still making more progress. But I think that as part of a regulatory framework here, it would be good if every company had to issue a transparency report outlining what they're seeing on their platforms and the results and effectiveness of their content moderation systems. So that way, the people who are responsible for holding all of us accountable, whether it's journalists, Congress, academics, could have an apples to apples comparison about how all the different companies are doing, and potentially, as part of a law, require that companies even maintain a certain level of effectiveness.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey, when Twitter decided to take down the story, the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop, did you do that under your terms of service or did you do it under some other claim of authority?
We did it under our terms of service, which, as you know, everyone agrees to when they sign up for Twitter. And this was a policy around distribution of hacked materials. We did not want Twitter to be a distribution point for hacked materials.
Well, you do realize that by taking down that story, you probably gave it more prominence and more visibility than it ever would have gotten had you left it alone.
We realize that, and we recognize it as a mistake that we made, both in terms of the intention of the policy and also the enforcement action of not allowing people to share it publicly or privately, which is why we corrected it within 24 hours.
And Mr. Dorsey, why isn't Justice Brandeis's formulation in Whitney versus California, why shouldn't that apply to the internet platforms like yours? In other words, the cure for bad speech is not censorship, it's more speech. Why wouldn't that principle apply to Twitter?
I think it does apply. All of our policies are focused on encouraging more speech. What we saw and what the market told us was that people would not put up with abuse, harassment, and misleading information that would cause offline harm. and they would leave our service because of it. So our intention is to create clear policy, clear enforcement that enables people to feel that they can express themselves on our service and ultimately trust it.
So it was a business decision.
It was a business decision.
Thank you.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dorsey, in recent hearings before the Senate Commerce Committee, you said, I think, that Twitter has a policy against misinformation relating to civic integrity. President Trump and his allies have tweeted hundreds of false claims about the 2020 election. Trump has falsely claimed victory and alleged widespread voter fraud. So here's the question. Does misinformation about the results of an election and voter fraud relate to civic integrity? Why or why not?
Yes, it does, and we label those tweets when the election has not been called yet, or multiple sources have called it differently.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Did you say you have been able to tweet?
No, we have labeled the tweets that would indicate a different result in the election, called by multiple sources.
I see. At what point was that done?
Throughout the period, October 11th to up till today.
So when the tweet was initially came in, how long was it before you, quote, updated it?
We didn't update it. We put a label on it pointing to the broader conversation. Our goal is to connect people with more information around what's happening with the election. And that was, and that occurred anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes, but as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Is 30 minutes the maximum time?
I don't know. We can get you that information.
Would
we'll
you?
follow up.
I'm interested in this. Does misinformation about the results of an election and voter fraud relate to civic integrity? Why or why not?
Yes, it does, and we also label those tweets that would indicate whether fraud was happening. And again, we connect those to larger conversations on the platform. So we want to provide context here. That is our goal: providing more context, providing more information.
Okay, now a specific question, and I'm not sure actually what the answer to this should be, but on November 7, President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "I won this election by a lot," end quote. Obviously, that's not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Do you believe that label goes far enough to prevent the tweet's harms when the tweet is still visible and not accurate?
I do, because it's not just the surface level label. It points to a collection of news articles, of information and conversation that gives you an expansion on what's happening with the election.
I guess you see, my concerns are that these tweets arouse people. And it seems to me that the entity that runs this operation ought to have an understanding that when there is a major situation, that the tweets can play a unique role in either reassuring or stirring people up to unacceptable levels. Could you comment on that?
Well, I agree in spirit. I mean, our policy is focused on misleading information around the election and the civic process to provide greater context, to provide additive information so that people can make decisions around what's happening within the election. And that is 3 phases. That's the run up to the election, that's election day, and also the phase we're in right now, post-election. So our policies and enforcement are focused on providing more information, more context to people in those three phases.
Well, let me give you a specific. On November 7, President Trump tweeted this: "I won this election by a lot." End quote. That's obviously not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Now, here's the question. Does that label do enough to prevent the tweet's harms when the tweet is still visible and is not accurate?
I believe it's really important that we show people a broader context, and that is the intention of the label. It is not just text below a tweet. It is a link to connect to a much larger conversation and news articles across the spectrum.
Well, give me an example of what would have to happen before the situation would warrant a stronger response.
Well, we did have stronger responses during Election Day and the week after, where we did put an interstitial, meaning that you had to click through to see the content of the tweet, and it limited spread for anything that went against our civic integrity policy, including premature calls to election results.
Well, let me give you one more. On November 12, President Trump tweeted a conspiracy theory that 2.7 million votes for him were deleted. The warning label that Twitter has applied to that tweet said, quote, "This claim about election fraud is disputed." Now, here's the question, and I think it is a tough issue. Do you believe this label does enough to prevent the tweet's harms? When the tweet is still visible, it's a highly emotional situation, but the tweet has no factual basis.
But the tweet has a link to more information, to more conversation, and more context that informs the situation, what's happening. So I do believe that connecting people to the larger conversation, giving them more context, is the right path here.
But they have to move to solicit that contact, right? It's not contained as an addendum to the original tweet.
The label is an addendum to the original tweet, and if you tap on it or click it, you will go to an expansion of the information.
I see. Can I ask a question, Mr. Zuckerberg? Is he?
Yes, you may. If you
Thank you.
that'd be okay.
Mr. Zuckerberg, at the recent hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee, you said that Facebook has a, quote, "policy in place that prevents any candidate," end quote, from, quote, "trying to delegitimize the result of the election," end quote. But the hashtags "steal the vote" and "voter fraud" garnered more than 300,000 interactions on your platform in the hours after Mr. Trump falsely declared victory. So here's the question. Do you believe Facebook did enough to prevent Trump's efforts to delegitimize the election result? If so, why have you reached that conclusion?
Senator, I believe that we've taken some very significant steps in this area, not just the adding additional context to specific posts and making it so that when people search for different hashtags, we show additional information. But we also took the unprecedented step of putting the Voter Information Center at the top of Facebook and Instagram for everyone in the U.S. that showed them reliable information about the election, including partnering with organizations like Reuters and the National Election Pool to show them accurate information about the results of the election. So all taken together, I think that we really went quite far in terms of helping to distribute reliable and accurate information about what was going on during this election.
Okay, let me give you one more along this line. After President Trump falsely claimed that the election was being stolen, a group called Stop the Steal was started on Facebook. It grew to more than 300,000 users in less than a day, making it one of the fastest growing groups, I understand, in Facebook history. You shut the group down, but substantial damage already had been done. Trump supporters, some of them armed with assault weapons, held Stop the Steal rallies outside election offices. In Philadelphia, 2 armed supporters who had traveled from Virginia were arrested on their way to the city's vote counting center. Here's the question, and this is a tough one. What are your concerns about the spread of misinformation, no matter how innocent it is, or it is not innocent, like Trump's claims about the election, that they may incite violence?
Senator, I'm very worried about this, especially any misinformation or content that could incite violence. And during such a volatile period like this, one of our top priorities is making sure that people don't use our platform to organize any violence or civil unrest. And that was the basis under which we took that group, because there were a number of members who were posting potentially violent or encouraging violent comments that violated our policies. We also have broader policies in place around trying to slow the spread of misinformation more broadly, even when it's not going to lead to some kind of violence or imminent harm. And that's why we've created this independent fact-checking program where we work with more than 80 partners around the world to help do fact-checking, because people in our community have told us they don't want to see misinformation, but they also don't want us to be deciding what is true and false. So we've taken the step of building this program, which I believe is more sophisticated than what anyone else in our industry has. So I'm very focused on these issues.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, because I'm really struck by it, that people armed with assault weapons as a product of a tweet could rally outside an election office. And I think it's really a serious issue that needs to be considered. And there need to be, once you signal that and people respond to it, it has to be in some way abated or some way pointed out or restructured on the internet itself. Now, can you respond to that?
Senator Feinstein, I hate to, we're almost double the time. Could we?
I'm sorry.
That's all right. We're going to have a vote come up, and I apologize. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to note that as far as the president's arguments about the election and how they turned out, inciting violence, I'd like to point out here that the only violence that I'm aware of has occurred in connection with Antifa. Antifa's response to pro-Trump peaceful rally attenders. So I don't quite understand that. Maybe we'll have a chance to dwell on that more in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about federal law, existing federal law, and what it requires. Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits businesses from engaging in unfair or deceptive trade practices. Compliance with this particular law requires that there be some consistency between what a company represents as their practices and their products and what they actually are. In other words, you can't sell one thing and provide another under the guise of providing something different than what's being sold. Both Twitter and Facebook represent and have represented for years to their users, their customers, that they take a neutral approach to election content moderation. However, as we've heard today, and as we will continue to hear today and into the foreseeable future, there are instances in which your platforms are taking a very distinctively partisan approach, and not a neutral one, to election-related content moderation. For example, just days before the election, Twitter suspended the account of Mark Morgan. Now, Mark Morgan is the commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office. And they suspended Commissioner Morgan's Twitter account, specifically for a tweet celebrating the success of the U.S. southern border wall. Apparently, Commissioner Morgan's tweet, his comments about the border wall, violated Twitter platform rules governing what it calls hateful conduct. Now, I've read the offending post, and the offending post from Commissioner Mark Morgan reads as follows. At CBP and the Army Corps of Engineers, continue to build new wall every day. Every mile helps us stop gang members, murderers, sexual predators, and drugs from entering our country. It's a fact. Walls work. Period. Close quote. Mr. Dorsey, can you tell me, in one sentence, what exactly is hateful about Commissioner Morgan's tweet that I just read?
Well, we evaluated this tweet again, and we found that we were wrong. That was a mistake, and it was due to the fact that we had heightened awareness around government accounts during this time. So that was a mistake. We reverted it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to get back to more of that in a minute and get back to the fact that, I understand that mistakes happen. But what we're going to see today is that mistakes happen a whole lot more, almost entirely on one side of the political aisle rather than the other. Now, Commissioner Morgan's statement in that tweet, as was initially taken down, is factual. There's nothing remotely hateful about it, and yet it was taken down. Now, on October 15th, Facebook relied on a third-party fact-checker's assessment to ban 2 advertisements from Facebook for, quote, partly false information. Now, both of these advertisements were factual in nature, and they revealed Joe Biden's and Kamala Harris's views on late-term abortion. Joe Biden has stated that he won't accept any restrictions on abortion, and Senator Harris's views are such that she voted against requiring care for a child born alive during a botched abortion. The very next day, the third-party fact-checker issued a statement retracting the assessment and retracting it as erroneous. However, it stunningly took Facebook almost 2 more weeks until October 29th, when voting had already started in many jurisdictions, to lift the ban on these legitimate ads. Ads that the fact-checker had already declared a couple weeks earlier were erroneously taken down. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, why on earth did it take Facebook 2 weeks to correct this error?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the details of us re-enabling that ad, so I can follow up with you after. It's possible that this was just a mistake or delay, and unfortunately, when we handle millions or billions of pieces of content a day, while we strive to do as well as possible and be as precise as possible, we will make some mistakes.
Thank you. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the fact that there are mistakes. As I've noted previously, those mistakes sure happen a whole lot more on one side of the political spectrum than the other. Now, this is understandable. We're humans, but it's also understandable why this might occur. Maybe some of it has to do with your employees. 92.83% of Facebook employees who donated to federal candidates gave to Democrats. At Twitter, it's even more stark than that, as if it could get much more stark, but 99.3% of Twitter employees who donated to federal candidates gave to Democrats. And so these mistakes, they may be mistakes, but they're mistakes that rhyme. They may not repeat themselves, but they rhyme. And the consistent theme happens to be Republicans, conservatives, and pro-life activists. Now, I'd like to ask both of you, is there a list of every user or every content creator who has been deplatformed or had their content's reach altered or have had some other adverse action taken by either Facebook or Twitter altered? Is there some list that identifies each user for which that has happened? Mr. Zuckerberg, let's hear from you. Just a yes or no question. Does such a list exist?
Senator, I'm not aware of anything like that existing.
Mr. Dorsey, how about you?
Not exactly sure what you're asking, but
Yeah.
we certainly.
Simple question. Do you have a list of people, your users or content creators, who have had some adverse action taken against them, either being deplatformed or having their reach altered or something because of the content of their posts?
Well, certainly whenever we take an action, it's recorded somewhere in a database, but I'm not sure if that's your intent.
No, that's helpful. So what I'm hearing from both of you is that while there may not be an actual list, and I'd like you both to check to see if such a list exists, but even if there isn't, there is a de facto list because you have within your databases records of occasions when this has occurred. And so I'd like to ask both of you, if such a list exists, please send it to me. I'd like to see it. If such a list does not exist, you certainly do have the data necessary in order to generate some, and I request as a member of this committee that you generate such a list and provide it to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Graham, the chairman of the committee, has stepped out momentarily. I've been directed to recess the hearing momentarily so that we can go and vote, and then we will pick up back here in just a few minutes. I would like to, as long as I have the gavel momentarily, I'm going to ask one more question before I leave to go vote, and then we'll recess the hearing after this question.
Could I ask when we're coming back? I've been waiting to ask questions for an hour now.
Yeah, we'll be coming back as soon as Senator Graham returns. He left to vote in just a moment ago. He'll be back. Mr. Zuckerberg, in September, Facebook tagged an ad run by the American Principles Project in Michigan that criticized Joe Biden and criticized Senator Gary Peters. And the ad was tagged because it was, quote unquote, missing context. Now, the next day, the ad was shut down entirely by Facebook. Facebook relied on a supposed fact check from PolitiFact, which is a nice way for you to avoid taking accountability for the problem, except that the fact check in question literally said that the ad, quote, makes, quote, predictions we can't fact check. Apparently this had to do with lacking context. So when did lacking context become a new standard for political ads? I mean, all political ads, all ads in general, but certainly all political ads lack context. Ben Sass just finished a resounding victory in Nebraska. And I haven't seen his TV ads, but I'm sure they're brilliant. This guy's made for television. He's with or without the beard. And I'm sure his ads didn't say, Ben Sass, great senator, but not that great of a hockey player. Or there is always context that is lacked out, that is lacking, left out in any advertisement. So what does that mean? And have you applied the missing context label to any Democratic ads, a single one that you can identify?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that specific standard, but as kind of a background on the fact-checking program, the basis of this is that we have heard resoundingly from our community that people do not want to see misinformation and believe that it is a problem. But people also believe that they do not want Facebook to be the arbiter of truth in deciding everything that is true and false. And for what it's worth, I strongly agree with that. And I do not think it is the right thing for us to assume that role. So within those bounds, we've tried to create a fact-checking program that works with independent third parties who have been accredited by the Poynter Institute for Journalism, which I think is widely respected. And we give those fact-checkers the latitude to determine whether ads or other content on our service is accurate, and if not, we apply some demotions or we prevent them from being run as ads. I can follow up in more detail afterwards on on the specifics of your questions, since I'm not as familiar with them right now.
I would appreciate that very much if you'd be willing to do that, because it's not only inconsistent with logic and with what the standards that apply in every other advertising context that I'm familiar with. It's also inconsistent with what Facebook itself does. Just to give you some context for that, while we're talking about missing context, I recently posted something about the election on Facebook. And my Facebook post was almost immediately tagged with the following, quote, election officials say that voter fraud, which is historically rare, has not affected the outcome in this election. They have confirmed that mail-in voting was conducted in accordance with state voting rules, close quote. Now, I find this a little disturbing. Tag, to me, sounds a whole lot more like state-run media announcing the party line rather than a neutral company, as it purports to be, running an open online forum. This kind of editorializing insulates people from the truth, and it insinuates that anyone concerned about voter fraud must be crazy. It also states it as if it were an irrefutable, neutral, objective fact. Now, maybe these kinds of concerns are out of the mainstream in Palo Alto, but they're not out of the mainstream with the rest of America. And I have to reiterate, I hope this kind of manipulation wasn't intentional, but it's getting harder and harder for me to accept the premise that it could be anything but intentional. And if it was intentional, it's yet more evidence that Facebook's actions surrounding this election are incongruent with the promises that you've made to your own users. And that's a problem. Consistent with the directions I've been given by Chairman Graham, we're now going to recess. I predict we'll be in recess for no more than 10 or 15 minutes until Chairman Graham returns. We stand in recess.
The committee will come to order. Senator Leahy.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, let me start by
see
saying
you too, Senator. You look great.
It's my thick head of hair. That's what does it. But I want to say that I recognize the challenging position that the social media companies are in. You know, your platforms host much of the news that America and actually the world use to stay informed. So you're on the front line of both domestic and foreign disinformation campaigns, and you have to balance American ideals like freedom of speech. You have to limit hate speech. You have to limit dangerous misinformation. That's a significant challenge. I saw one of the people who came here to demonstrate last weekend in Washington saying they were there because they had found out that China had 1 minute before the polls closed dumped millions of votes for Joe Biden. And somebody said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, it was on the internet. It's got to be accurate. But now your platforms have taken some positive steps. I mentioned that one thing, and I hear from people all the time to stop me with some of these misinformation, sometimes very dangerous misinformation. They've gotten it from your platforms. And I have to think you can and must do better. You know, our security, I think even our democracy, understanding a basic truth depends upon you doing a better job. President Obama described the escalating erosion of the acceptance of facts, of science, of clear evidence as truth decay. Well, without facts, it's hard to imagine how a government by and for the people can exist, and your platforms can bring people together. I think often they act as a form of driving people apart. Now, during this election, President Trump has emerged as the most prominent distributor of false and misleading election information. He still does it. It's nothing short of propaganda. Without evidence, he routinely claims the election was rigged, says that states actually cheated and fixed the results. He even claims that millions of Trump votes were deleted. And he's doing that while his own Department of Homeland Security is saying the election was the most secure in American history. And there's no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was any way compromised. That's what our own U.S. government is saying, when the head of government, the president, is saying just the opposite. So it may make him feel better about the fact that he lost badly, but we shouldn't have to put up with it. So I have a question for both of you. Has Facebook or Twitter conducted an in-depth post-mortem review of election misinformation spread on your platforms? Not just what you labeled, but how far the misinformation reached. Have you done that kind of a post-mortem?
Senator, we will do that analysis, and also we are commissioning and working with independent academics to enable them to do the studies themselves and to publish what they find without any intervention or permission required from Facebook.
Thank you. And
we are doing the same, including opening up our APIs to researchers to make sure that others are able to see what we may not see ourselves.
Will that be made available to us? Can other people see that results of that that study you're going to do? Both of you, I'd ask.
Senator, yes, the academic research is going to be public, and the academics are going to be able to publish this themselves without even having to get Facebook's approval over what they publish.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey?
And we'll make our reports and findings public as well, so everyone can learn.
I'll look forward to reading them. And I'm actually one member of the Senate will actually read them. So thank you. Because, you look at some of the things that went on. There was I know Senator Blumenthal and others have raised this question about the Steve Bannon putting on a video. Think of what it did. It called for the murder, the beheading of Dr. Fauci and the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray. Just think what that does. I mean, the FBI director travels with security all the time. Dr. Fauci and his family are private citizens. They're calling for their beheading. And it was seen by, I think, 200,000 people on Facebook. Well, now, if you're going to have somebody threatening to murder somebody, what do you do? What do you do about that? I mean, how do you catch that in a hurry? Because, I mean, I was a prosecutor. I prosecuted murderers, and we didn't have to face this kind of threat at that time. But what do you do when hundreds of thousands of people see a threat, go murder somebody?
Senator, in that case, that content violated our policies and we took it down. And as has been the subject of some of the other questions, if someone had multiple offenses like that, we would remove their whole account.
Well, that I'm sure that's the threat that if they multiple times say go out and murder somebody, cut off their head, we're going to face a real problem. Facebook will take down our posting. Oh my goodness, what a deterrent.
So, Senator, what we try to do is identify content that violates our policy before anyone in the community has to see it or even report it to us. And for some categories like terrorism, which I've cited before, about 98 or 99% of the content that we take down our AI and human systems find before anyone even has to report it to us. On hate speech, we're up to 94% of the content that we take down, our AI systems and content reviewers find it before people have to report it to us. What we try to drive on more effectiveness is basically finding more and more of that harmful content earlier before it is seen broadly across our system.
Well, let me ask you about that because, we've had these discussions before. I'm deeply concerned about Facebook's role in spreading hate speech in Myanmar. Hate speech that helped fuel a genocide against the Muslim Rohingya people. And I mean, horrible. I've seen the pictures. I've seen what's happened to the genocide. Now, you've made some progress about this since you and I had talked about it last. But my understanding is that Facebook shuts down specific accounts that violate your content-related policy, but then that user can, of course, just create a new account. In Myanmar, for example, on October 8th, Facebook took down 38 inauthentic accounts created and controlled by members of the Myanmar military, in part to promote anti-Rohingya content. And I compliment you for doing that. But the Myanmar military just turned around and created new accounts to promote the same content. So in some way, you got a whack-a-mole problem here. But is there a way that you can stop these things, not just at the account level, but at the user level? And I use that as an example because people are being murdered in a systematic genocide.
Please answer Senator Leahy's question, then we'll need to move on. But go ahead.
And I'm sorry to take long, but the previous questioner took all his time plus all the time that had been allotted to me.
Yeah, no, we're at 2.5 minutes, and let's just wrap it up, but go ahead and answer the question.
Senator, you're correctly pointing out that we did disable certain generals in the Myanmar military as dangerous figures, and they are not allowed to sign up for new accounts. But As you point out, these kind of integrity problems are not ones that there's a silver bullet or where you can ever fully solve them. We will always be working to help minimize the prevalence of harm, in the same way that a city will never eliminate all crime. You try to reduce it and get it and have it be as little as possible. And that's what we try to do through a combination of building AI systems to identify harmful content up front, hiring thousands of people and tens of thousands of people to do content review, and partnering with organizations, whether it's in the intelligence community, law enforcement, election officials, or in Myanmar, local civil society to help us flag things that we should be aware of and on high alert about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have some questions for the record for both of the witnesses.
Thank you very much, Senator Lay. I appreciate that. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facebook and Twitter and Google have massive power. They have a monopoly on public discourse in the online arena. I will say it's dismaying listening to the questions from our Democratic colleagues, because consistently the message from Senate Democrats is for Facebook and Twitter and Google to censor more, to abuse their power more, to silence voices that Senate Democrats disagree with more. That is very dangerous if we want to maintain a free and fair democracy, if we want to maintain free speech. There was a time when Democrats embraced and defended the principles of free speech. There was a time when Democrats embraced and defended the principles of a free press. And yet there's an absolute silence from Democrats speaking up for the press outlets censored by big tech. There's an absolute silence for Democrats speaking out for the citizens silenced by big tech. Instead, there is a demand: use even more power to silence dissent. And that's a totalitarian instinct that I think is very dangerous. At the same time that big tech exercises massive power, it also enjoys massive corporate welfare through the effect of Section 230, a special immunity from liability that nobody else gets. Congress has given big tech, in effect, a subsidy while they become some of the wealthiest corporations on the face of the planet. Mr. Dorsey, I want to focus primarily on Twitter and ask you initially, is Twitter a publisher?
Is Twitter a publisher?
Yes.
No, we are not. We distribute information.
So what is a publisher?
An entity that is publishing under editorial guidelines and decisions.
Well, your answer happens to be contrary to the text of federal statute, particular Section 230, which defines an information content provider as any person or entity that is responsible in whole or in part for the creation or development of information provided through the internet or any other interactive computer service. Let me ask you, was Twitter being a publisher when it censored the New York Post?
No, we have very clear policies on the conduct we enable on the platform. And if there's a violation, we take an enforcement action, and people choose to commit to those policies and to those terms of service.
Except your policies are applied in a partisan and selective manner. You claim it was hacked materials, and yet you didn't block the distribution of the New York Times story that alleged to talk about President Trump's tax returns, even though a federal statute makes it a crime to distribute someone's tax returns without their consent. You didn't block any of that discussion, did you?
Our policy was focused on distribution of the actual hacked materials.
Did you block the discussion of the president's tax return material?
And in the New York Times case, we interpret it as reporting about the hacked materials.
Did you block Edward Snowden when he illegally released material?
I don't have the answer to that.
The answer is no. You haven't used this in a selective manner. Let me ask you, were you being a publisher when you forced Politico and other journalistic outlet to take down their tweets on a topic that you had deemed impermissible?
No. We were enforcing our policy and our terms of service.
So on October 15th, Jake Sherman, a reporter at Politico, tweeted the following. I tweeted a link to the New York Post story right after it dropped yesterday morning. I immediately reached out to the Biden campaign to see if they had any answer. I wish I'd given the story a closer read before tweeting it. Twitter suspended me. So you actually have a reporter reporting on a story, asking the other side for comment. And Twitter says, hi, Jake Sherman, your account at Jake Sherman has been locked for violating Twitter rules. Now, what did the Politico reporter do? Immediately tweets after that, my goal was not to spread information. Well, that's a little worrisome just in and of itself. My goal was to raise questions about the story. Oh, my overlords in Silicon Valley, I was attacking the New York Post. You don't understand. I was attacking them, as I did in subsequent tweets, and see how the Biden campaign was going to respond. They later did respond. And then, not long after, Jake Sherman comes back with, my account is clearly no longer suspended. I deleted the tweet. When Twitter is editing and censoring and silencing, the New York Post, the newspaper with the fourth highest circulation in the country, and Politico, one of the leading newspapers in the country, is Twitter behaving as a publisher when it's deciding what stories reporters are allowed to write and publish and what stories they're not?
No, and that account was not suspended. It fell afoul of the hacked materials policy. We realized that there was an error in that policy and the enforcement.
Hold on, I'm literally looking at the tweet from Twitter that says your account has been locked. You're telling me that this is not an accurate...
That's a lock and can be unlocked when you delete the...
I understand that you have the star chamber power. Your answer is always, well, once we silence you, we can choose to allow you to speak. But you are engaged in publishing decisions. Let me shift to a different topic. Mr. Dorsey, does voter fraud exist?
I don't know for certain.
Are you an expert in voter fraud?
No, I'm not.
Well, why then is Twitter right now putting purported warnings on virtually any statement about voter fraud?
We're simply linking to a broader conversation so that people have more information.
No, you're not. You put up a page that says, quote, voter fraud of any kind is exceedingly rare in the United States. That's not linking to a broader conversation. That's taking a disputed policy position, and you're a publisher when you're doing that. You're entitled to take a policy position, but you don't get to pretend you're not a publisher and get a special benefit under Section 230 as a result.
That link is pointing to a broader conversation with tweets from publishers and people all around the country.
Mr. Dorsey, would the following statement violate Twitter's policies? Quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud.
I imagine that we would label it so that people can have more context in read through.
How about this quote? Quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political activists, voter fraud is particularly possible where, quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political party activists are involved in, quote, handling absentee ballots. Would you flag that as potentially misleading?
I don't know the specifics of how we might enforce that, but I imagine a lot of these would have a label pointing people to a bigger conversation.
Well, you're right. You would label them because you've taken the political position right now that voter fraud doesn't exist. I would note both of those quotes come from the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform. That is Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker. And Twitter's position is essentially voter fraud does not exist. Are you aware that just 2 weeks ago in the state of Texas, a woman was charged with 134 counts of election fraud? Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
If I tweeted that statement with a link to the indictment, would you put a warning on it that says, well, the Democratic Party position right now is voter fraud doesn't exist?
I don't think it's useful to get into hypotheticals, but I don't believe so.
You don't believe so? Well, we're going to test that because I'm going to tweet that and we'll see what you put on it. All right. Yesterday, Mr. Dorsey, you and I spent a considerable amount of time on the phone, and you said that you wanted to embrace transparency. So I want to ask you, I have asked Twitter, I've asked Facebook multiple times, How many times have you blocked Republican candidates for office, their tweets or their posts in 2016 and 2018 and 2020? How many times have you blocked Democratic candidates for office? How many times have you blocked Republican office holders? How many times have you blocked Democratic office holders? Twitter has repeatedly refused to answer that question with specific hard data and cataloging the examples. In the interest of transparency, which you said you want to embrace, will you commit in this hearing right now to answer those questions in writing?
And
That's
we'll
exactly
let that
what
be
we
the
want to
last
do.
question. Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dorsey, I didn't hear you.
That's exactly what we're pushing for as we think about building upon 230.
Is that a yes that you will
just
answer those questions in writing?
transparency, not just of outcomes, but also our process as well.
Is that a yes that you will answer those questions in writing?
We'll certainly look into it and see what we can do.
And actually answer them and not give lawyerly doublespeak about why you're not going to give specifics. Answer them. Will you commit to this committee that you will answer those questions?
We're going to work to answering broader transparency around outcomes.
All right, that's a no. Mr. Zuckerberg, how about you? Will you commit that Facebook will answer those specific questions, cataloging the number of instances in which Democrats in 16, 18, and 20 have been silenced versus the number of instances in which Republicans have been silenced on Facebook?
Senator, I'm not sure if we have that data available, but I will follow up with you or your team.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, and I'm going to take Twitter. We'll see if it's a yes or transparency is bogus and we don't intend to provide it.
Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We live in a dangerous world. Issues of national security, the worst pandemic, public health crisis in modern times in America, and we are being challenged as to whether there's going to be a peaceful transition of power in America in the presidency. At that moment in time, we decided none of those topics were important. And what was important was to determine whether or not social media was discriminating against Republicans. It's an interesting question. I think there are more important and timely questions. We have a recount underway in Georgia. We have allegations made by the election officials there where the Republican election officials, where they have faced literally death threats. We are trying to determine whether or not the social media instruments of America are fair to the Republican Party. I'm trying to struggle with this issue because I want to put it in a context, and maybe I can't. Maybe this is unique. We certainly know what the Constitution says when it comes to free speech, and we know what it meant over the years. New York Times versus Sullivan and others with publications. We certainly didn't suggest that anyone that used a telephone line for nefarious, illegal, banned activity somehow implicated the telephone company into it by its nature. And then came radio and TV, and we had to come up with new rules in terms of, at one time, equal time, fair content, and so forth. And now we have this relatively new mechanism of communicating information, and we're trying to determine what to do with it, whether to treat it like a newspaper publishing or treat it like some sort of a communications network alone. Section 230 is an attempt to do that, and I'm sure everybody finds fault with it. I'd like to ask the two witnesses if they would comment on the historical aspects of this particular debate, if they have any thoughts. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Senator, one of the points in the discussion that I find interesting is people ask if the regulatory model should be more like kind of the news industry or more like telcos. But from my perspective, these platforms are a new industry and should have a different regulatory model that is distinct from either of those other two. I think it is not the case that we're like a telco and that there are clearly some categories of content, whether it's terrorism or child exploitation, that people expect us to moderate and address. But we're also clearly not like a news publisher in that we don't create the content and we don't choose up front what we publish. We give people a voice to be able to publish things. So I do think that we have responsibilities, and it may make sense for there to be liability for some of the content that is on the platform. But I don't think that the analogies to these other industries that have been created previously will ever be kind of fully the right way to look at this. I think it deserves and needs its own regulatory framework to get built here.
Thank you. Would the other witness care to respond?
From a historical perspective, 230 has created so much goodness and innovation. And, if we didn't have those protections when we started Twitter 14 years ago, we could not start. And that's what we're most concerned with, is making sure that we continue to enable new companies to contribute to the internet, to contribute to conversation. And we do have to be very careful and thoughtful about changes to 230, because going one direction might box out new competitors and new startups. Going another might create a demand for an impossible amount of resources to handle it. And going yet another might encourage even more blocking of voices, or what's being raised here, which is censorship of voices, and changing the internet dramatically.
Go ahead.
So I believe that we can build upon 230. I think we can make sure that we're earning people's trust by encouraging more transparency around content moderation and our process of it. I think we need much more straightforward appeals. And I think the biggest point to really focus on going forward is algorithms and how they are managing and creating these experiences, and being able to have choice in how to use those algorithms on platforms like ours.
Let me get into a specific, Mr. Zuckerberg. October 10th, Detroit Free Press reported 13 men charged Thursday in a conspiracy to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer used Facebook and secure messaging apps to connect and plot their attack. The group's use of Facebook spans almost a full year. Members began to use the social media platform as a recruitment tool in November 2019, according to an affidavit by Brian Russell, Detective Sergeant, Michigan State Police. Once recruited, members communicated via a secured encrypting message platform. According to news reports, Facebook alerted the FBI about the Michigan kidnappers' online activity several months before the arrest. Thank goodness. However, in August, a Facebook page for the Kenosha Guard militia, which advocated violence in the aftermath of the shooting of Jacob Blake, was reportedly flagged over 455 times to Facebook. However, the page was deemed non-violating and left up. More than 4,000 people responded to that event. Hundreds of armed militia members showed up. A member of this group, a teenager from Illinois, later shot and killed 2 people on the streets of Kenosha. Mr. Zuckerberg, you described Facebook's handling of this militia page as an operational mistake. Can you explain the exact reason why the Kenosha militia page was not taken down?
Senator, yes. And first, what happened in Kenosha was obviously terrible. What happened here was we rolled out a strengthened policy around militia pages in general. Whereas before that, we would have allowed a group that was a militia as long as it wasn't planning or organizing violence directly. In the lead up to the election, we strengthened the policy to disallow more of those groups because we were on high alert and we're treating this situation as very volatile around potential civil unrest around the election. We just put that policy into place, and for a number of reasons, it had not yet been fully rolled out, and all of the content reviewers across the company hadn't been fully trained on that. So we made mistakes in assessing whether that group should be taken down. But upon appeal, when it was escalated to a more senior level of content review folks who have more specific expertise in these areas, we recognized that it did violate the policy, and we took it down. It was a mistake. It was certainly an issue, and we're debriefing and figuring out how we can do better. Although one other piece that I would add is that the person who carried out the shootings was not in any way connected to that page or linked to any of the content there from anything that we or others can tell.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one more question. Yesterday, the FBI released its annual hate crime incident report. The report found that more people were killed in hate-motivated violence in 2019 than any year since the FBI began collecting hate crime data in 1990. The report also found that race-based hate crimes remain the most common type of hate crimes last year, and documented increase in religion-based hate crimes, anti-Hispanic hate crimes, and hate crimes targeting individuals based on gender identity. Given these statistics, it appears to me that it's more important than ever for social media companies to combat hate on their platforms. And I might add to one of my colleagues who stated earlier, this is not Antifa, but these are documented hate crimes from FBI. Muslim advocates, Muslim have reached out to you many times, Mr. Zuckerberg, about this issue relating to published content that reflects on certain religious groups. And you said at a hearing you do not allow hate crimes on Facebook. Yet in May 2020, the Tech Transparency Project found more than 100 American white supremacist groups, many of them explicitly anti-Muslim, active on the platform both on their own group pages as well as auto-generated content. Facebook did nominally alter some of the content, but the hate groups largely remained. Are you looking the other way, Mr. Zuckerberg, in a potentially dangerous situation?
No, Senator. This is incredibly important, and we take hate speech as well as incitement of violence extremely seriously. We banned more than 250 white supremacist organizations and treat them the same as terrorist organizations around the world. And we've ramped up our capacity to identify hate speech and incitement of violence before people even see it on the platforms. Our AI and human review teams, you can track our results in the transparency reports that we issue, now take down about 94% of the hate speech that we find on our platforms before anyone has to even report it to us, which is a dramatic amount of progress from where we were a few years ago, where when we were just starting to ramp up on this, we're taking about 20% of it down before people had to report it to us. So there's still more progress to make. We're very invested in this, and you have my commitment that we view this as an issue of the highest severity and one that we are very focused on.
Thank you very much.
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hosting this hearing. Clearly important topics around content moderation. I'm a skeptic of the content moderation policies that exist, both because I don't think the standards are very transparent and I don't think the execution is very consistent. That said, I'm more skeptical than a lot of my colleagues, I think on both sides of the aisle, about whether or not there's a regulatory fix that will make it better instead of worse. I especially think it's odd that so many in my party are zealous to do this right now when you would have an incoming administration of the other party that would be writing the rules and regulations about it. And I think it's telling that a number of folks on the other side of the dais, I think of Senator Blumenthal, a guy I like, but who seemed to almost be giddy about the prospect of a new government regulatory agency to police online speech. And I think a lot of people on my side should take pause at the idea that so many on the other side of the aisle are excited about having the next administration get to write these rules and regulations. But to the broader question, first, just to get to kind of a level set, and I want to thank both the witnesses for being here today. But when Senator Lee lays out some of the issues he did about, just the every human community is going to be situated in a different place about policy commitments and priorities and beliefs. But when Senator Lee said that 93% of Facebook employees who contribute to politics do so on the left, and 99%, I think it was, of Twitter employees contribute on the left, I would just be interested to see if either of the two of you think that has implications in the shepherding of your organizations. Again, I recognize fully that you're private organizations, and so again, I'm more skeptical of a governmental fix for a lot of the problems we're talking about here today. But I'm curious as to whether or not Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, and I guess we'll start with Facebook, I'm curious as to whether or not you think it's likely that there is systemic bias inside your organization in the execution of content moderation policies, given that your employee base is so unrepresentative of America in general.
Senator, I think it's a good question, and certainly I think it means that we have to be more intentional about what we do and thoughtful. Our principle and goal is to give everyone a voice and to be a platform for all ideas. As you mentioned, I do think it's undisputed that our employee base, at least the full-time folks, politically would be somewhat, or maybe more than just a little somewhat, to the left of where our overall community is, where the community basically spans almost wide varieties of people across society. So I do think that means that we need to be careful and intentional internally to make sure that bias doesn't seep into decisions that we make. Although I'd point out a couple of things. One is that people have a lot of different views outside of work, and we expect and I think generally see that people conduct themselves professionally. And second, the folks who are doing the content review work, we have about 35,000 people doing content review, are typically not based in Silicon Valley. They're based in places all over the country and all over the world, because we serve people in countries all over the world. So I think that the geographic diversity of that is more representative of the community that we serve than just the full-time employee base in our headquarters in the Bay Area.
Thanks, Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. Dorsey?
Yeah, this is obviously not something we interview for, and even have, an understanding of when people are in the company. And with that understanding, we intend to make sure that both our policy and our enforcement is objective. And I realize that it looks rather opaque, and certainly the outcomes might not always match up with our intention, and the perception of those outcomes may not match up. But that's why I think it's so important that we're not just transparent around our policies, but the actual operations of our content moderation. If people don't trust our intent, if people are questioning that, that's a failure. And that is something that we need to fix and intend to fix. And I think it would benefit the industry as well. But I do, again, point back to something I said earlier on the testimony, which is a lot of these decisions are not being made by humans anymore. They're being made by algorithms. And that's certainly enforcement decisions, but also decisions around what you see or what you don't see. And to me, that is the body of work. That is the conversation that we should be focused on, because that is the enduring use case for everyone who interacts with these services.
Thank you, and I wish it were true that these were all easy, objective questions. That the questions were, if somebody says, "Is the sky green?" That's an objective question. That the sky is blue and white, not green. But most of the things we're talking about here, and the places where you're applying content moderation labels, are not really simply objective questions. They're mostly subjective questions. If we talked about Medicare for all being, easily paid for inside a 10-year budget window on assumptions X, Y, and Z that don't raise taxes, that's not true. There isn't any math by which Medicare for all pays for itself in some short-term window. but I don't think any of us really think you're going to slap a label on that saying this is disputed, accounting or math or policy projections. And so really what's happening is there's a prioritization grid that people are going through as they build even the algorithms, even those that aren't driven by humans, and they're driven by policy priorities of situated individuals. I may be wrong about this, but my suspicion is that your employee base is not actually 99% left of center. I bet it's less than that. And I would speculate that part of the reason less than 1% of your employees give money to candidates on the right is because there's a social stigma attached to having conservative views inside your organization. And I would guess that those same sort of internal cultural biases inform the subjectivity of which issues end up labeled. So again, this is sort of an odd place to be in that I am skeptical that the content moderation policies are thought out well. They're not transparent enough for us to really know, but I'm definitely skeptical that they're consistently applied. And yet I'm not really on the side of thinking there's some easy governmental fix here. There's a lot about Section 230 that we could debate. I think some of the things Senator Durbin said about how in the era of telephones, nobody blamed the phone company for other people having spread misinformation by the phone. Exactly, that's what would be the case if Section 230 were actually neutral, but you're applying content moderation policies and seemingly in a way that's not objective. So I know that I'm nearly at time, but I think it would be useful for us to hear from both of you to give a sort of 3 or 5 year window into the future. If there isn't new legislation, what is changing besides just saying we're moving from humans to more AI? What qualitatively is changing in the way content moderation happens inside your organizations, short of a new regulatory scheme? Can you tell us where you think you're actually improving and what problems you're trying to solve? Mr. Zuckerberg, you first, please.
Senator, one of the areas that we're very focused on is transparency, both in the process and in the results. So we're already at the point where every quarter we issue a community standards enforcement report that basically details the prevalence of each category of harmful content and how effective we are at addressing it before people have to even report it to us. Over time, we would like to fill that out and have more detail in that and make it more robust. We've already committed to an independent external audit of those metrics that people can trust them even more. People have lots of different kinds of requests for where we might go with that in the future, whether that's breaking down the stats by country or language or into more granular buckets, adding more data around precision. But I think that would all be very helpful so that people can see and hold us accountable for how we're doing. And for what it's worth, I think that would be a valuable part of a regulatory framework that would not feel particularly overreaching to me, is something that could be put in law that would create an apples to apples framework that all companies in this space would have to report on the outcomes and effectiveness of their programs in that way. So at least we can see how everyone is doing. That seems like a sensible step to me.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
Senator Whitehouse.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Dorsey's still answering the same question, and then I'll give it back to you in a hurry, Mr.
So
Lay.
sorry, I missed that.
It's a junior acting chairman. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Well, I mean, if we're considering 3 to 5 years out, I think the realization that a centralized global content moderation system does not scale, and we need to rethink how we operate these services. And I would point to, we certainly need transparency around any process that we have and around the practice and the outcomes of those moderations. But I think having more control so that individuals can moderate themselves, pushing the power of moderation to the edges and to our customers and to the individuals using the service is something we'll see more of. And I also believe that having more choice around how algorithms are altering my experience and creating my experience is important. So being able to turn off ranking algorithms, being able to choose different ranking algorithms that are found, written by third-party developers and somewhat of an algorithmic marketplace, I think is important and a future that would excite and energize us.
Thank you. I've appreciated my interaction with both of your companies in the run-up to this, and I think both of you said some meaty things there about ways we can move toward greater transparency, so I'll follow up again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, let me start with just a moment's history to give some context to my questions. When the tobacco industry discovered that its product was deadly, it responded to that news with a systematized program of denying that set of facts. The upshot for the tobacco industry was not great. It was found in federal court to have been engaged in massive fraud and was put under court order to cease its fraudulent behavior. At around the same time, the fossil fuel industry began to run into a similar problem regarding the effects of its product, and it picked up the tobacco industry scheme kind of where it left off, including using some of the same individuals, some of the same entities, many of the same methods as the tobacco industry's denial operation. These are persistent, highly motivated, very well-funded and complex information operations, not unlike a hostile intelligence service would run. And they are quite secretive. And we're now seeing a new form, I guess you'd call it election denial, happening around our country right now. So that's the background that I come at this from seeing. And I'm wondering if each of you see a difference between individual error and basically mass disinformation. Is there a difference between odd people with fringe views who offer personal opinions and an orchestrated plan of deliberate misinformation or disinformation that is driven by motivated interests, whether foreign or domestic?
Senator, I absolutely think that there's a difference, and you can see it in the patterns of use on the platforms. And in our policies and operations, we view these coordinated, inauthentic behavior operations, networks of fake and sometimes combining with real accounts to push out a message, but make it seem like it's coming from a different place than it is, or might be more popular than it is. This is what we saw the Internet Research Agency out of Russia do in 2016. And since then, a number of other governments and private organizations, including some companies like what you've mentioned, have engaged in this behavior. Now, the good news is that I think that the industry has generally gotten its systems to be a lot more sophisticated to defend against that in the last several years. It's a combination of AI systems that we've built to find networks of accounts that aren't really behaving quite the way that a normal person would, coupled with large numbers of content reviewers, sometimes with expertise in counterterrorism or counterintelligence, and then some signal sharing, whether it's with the intelligence community, law enforcement, different groups that have expertise in different areas, and with other tech platforms. But this is a big effort on I think all of our sides to make sure that we can defend against this kind of interference, and I think we are getting better and better at it.
Well, let me encourage you to persist. As you know, the last time you were here, you were asked about advertising paid for on Facebook denominated in rubles, which was not a very sophisticated scheme to be able to penetrate, but Facebook was unable to penetrate it, and your upgrade from that original setup was simply to allow a shell corporation to intermediate between the real actor and not. So I encourage you to continue to try to make sure that real voices are what are heard on Facebook. Mr. Dorsey, let me turn to you and ask you the same question in the context of bots. Brown University recently did a study that showed that about 25% of all tweets about climate change are generated by bots. Most of them obviously push out climate denial, as I described that operation. How is Twitter's capacity to identify a bot as opposed to a real customer?
Well, to build off your previous question, I do think there is a difference, as Mark said, and I do think there are many coordinated campaigns to manipulate public conversation, to divide people all around the world, to confuse and generally to distract. And we do have policies and enforcement to prevent as much of this as possible. It is a growing threat, and it shows no signs of slowing down. Bots are one way that entities do this. Sometimes it may look like a bot, but it's actually a human that is organized with other humans for a particular agenda. So it is challenging. We are doing work right now to better identify bots on our service.
Let me just interject, Mr. Dorsey, real quick. As a baseline proposition, do you agree that a bot does not deserve a voice on your platform, that it should be actual people and organizations?
I don't agree with that as a high level. I think we should be labeling bots so that people have greater context for what they're interacting with.
Fair enough.
There are plenty of bots on our service that provide a valuable function, and I wouldn't want to take that away.
Let me ask both of you, and maybe you can supplement this with the answer in writing for the record, because my time is getting short and this is a complicated question. But the question is, when does it matter to Twitter and when does it matter to Facebook to know who the actual entity is who is using your platform? Let me start with you, Mr. Dorsey, since Mr. Zuckerberg went first last time. And you can defer to a written answer if you like, because my time's running very short.
We'll add to this conversation with a written answer, but I do believe that pseudonymity is important. We have seen its usefulness with activists and with whistleblowers, and I think that is critical. But certainly there are times, and it's judged by a severity of potential outcomes, where we need to dig into identity and take actions.
We'll follow up with that, and let me just ask you, since my time has expired, Mr. Zuckerberg, to respond, or have your organization respond in writing. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we, Senator Whitehouse brought up something very important, and I'm going to add this as directly as I can. To Facebook and Twitter, do you have any internal research or evidence to suggest that your platforms can be addictive? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Senator, I think we can follow up with a summary of research that we have, but from what I've seen so far, it's inconclusive, and most of the research suggests that the vast majority of people do not perceive or experience these services as addictive or have issues. But I do think that there should be controls given to people to help them manage their experience better. Okay. And this is something that we're very focused on.
Mr. Dorsey.
I'm not aware of internal research, but we can follow up. But I do think, like anything else, these tools can be addictive, and we should be aware of that, acknowledge it, and make sure that we are making our customers aware of better patterns of usage. So the more information, the better here.
Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the late 19th century, the heads of the biggest corporations in America, the robber barons, got together and they set rates, they set prices, they determined how they would control information flow, they determined how they get rid of competition. And I'll be darned if we aren't right back there again. Except for this time, you're the robber barons. Your companies are the most powerful companies in the world, and I want to talk about how you're coordinating together to control information. In recent days, my office was contacted by a Facebook whistleblower, a former employee of the company with direct knowledge of the company's content moderation practices, and I want to start by talking about an internal platform called Tasks that Facebook uses to coordinate projects, including censorship. The Tasks platform allows Facebook employees to communicate about projects they're working on together. That includes Facebook's censorship teams, including the so-called community well-being team, the integrity team, and the hate speech engineering team, who all use the task platform to discuss which individuals or hashtags or websites to ban. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, you're familiar with the task platform, aren't you?
Senator, we use the task system for, I think it's, as you say, for people coordinating all kinds of work across the company, although I'm not sure if I'd agree with the characterization specifically around content moderation that you gave.
Well, let's get into that, and let me see if we can refresh your memory and provide folks at home watching with an example. Here over my shoulder is an example. It's a screenshot of the task platform in use. You'll notice if the cameras zoom in, several references to election integrity throughout on these lists of tasks. Again, this is shared across Facebook's sites, company locations, by working groups. What particularly intrigued me is that the platform reflects censorship input from Google and Twitter as well. So Facebook, as I understand it, Facebook censorship teams communicate with their counterparts at Twitter and Google and then enter those companies' suggestions for censorship onto the task platform so that Facebook can then follow up with them and effectively coordinate their censorship efforts. Mr. Zuckerberg, let me just ask you directly, under oath now, does Facebook coordinate its content moderation policies or efforts in any way with Google or Twitter?
Senator, let me be clear about this. We do coordinate on and share signals on security-related topics. So, for example, if there is signal around a terrorist attack or around child exploitation imagery or around a foreign government creating an influence operation, that is an area where the companies do share signals about what they see. But I think it's important to be very clear that that is distinct from the content moderation policies that we or the other companies have, where once we share intelligence or signals between the companies, each company makes its own assessment of the right way to address and deal with that information.
Well, I'm talking about content moderation. I'm talking about individuals, websites, hashtags, phrases to ban. Is it your testimony that you do not communicate with Twitter or Google about content moderation, about individuals, websites, phrases, hashtags to ban? Just yes or no. Do you communicate with Twitter or Google about coordinating your policies in this way?
Senator, we do not coordinate our policies.
Do your Facebook content moderation teams communicate with their counterparts at Twitter or Google?
Senator, I'm not aware of anything specific, but I think it would be probably pretty normal for people to talk to their peers and colleagues in the industry.
It would be normal, but you don't do it?
No, I'm saying that I'm not aware of any particular conversation, but I would expect that some level of communication probably happens. But that is different from coordinating what our policies are or our responses in specific instances.
Well, fortunately, I understand that the task platform is searchable. So will you provide a list of every mention of Google or Twitter from the tasks platform to this committee?
Senator, that's something that I can follow up with you and your team after on.
Well, yes or no, I'm sure you can follow up with the list, but why don't you commit while I've got you here under oath? It's so much better to do this under oath. Will you commit now to providing a list from the tasks platform of every mention of Google or Twitter?
Senator, respectfully, I'm without having looked into this, I'm not aware of any sensitivity that might exist around that. So I don't think it would be wise for me to commit to that right now.
So
but I would be happy to follow.
How many items on the task platform reflect that Facebook, Twitter, and Google are sharing information about websites or hashtags or platforms that they want to suppress?
Senator, I do not know.
Will you provide a list of every website and hashtag that Facebook content moderation teams have discussed banning on the task platform?
Senator, again, I would be happy to follow up with you or your team to discuss further how we might move forward on that. But without
will you
understanding
commit
the
to it
specific-
here? Senator Cruz and Senator Lee both asked you for lists of individuals, websites, entities that have been subject to content moderation. You expressed doubt about whether any such information exists, but you've also now said that the task website, you've acknowledged the task platform exists, that it is searchable. So will you commit to providing the information you have logged on the task website about content moderation that your company has undertaken? Yes or no?
Senator, I think it would be better to follow up once I've had a chance to discuss with my team what any sensitivity around that would be that might prevent the kind of sharing that you're talking about. But once I've done that, I would be happy to follow up.
All right. So you won't commit to do it here. We could, of course, subpoena this information, but I'd much rather get it from you voluntarily. But I think let everybody take note that Mr. Zuckerberg has now repeatedly refused to provide information that he knows that he has and has now acknowledged that he has, that Tasks has under oath. Let me switch to a different topic. Mr. Zuckerberg, tell me about Sintra. What is the Facebook internal tool called Sintra?
Senator, I'm not aware of any tool with that name.
Well, let me see if this refreshes your memory. There's a demonstrative now over my shoulder. Sintra is a tool that Facebook uses to track its users, not just on Facebook, but across the entire internet. Sintra tracks different profiles that a user visits, their message recipients, their linked accounts, the pages they visit around the web that have Facebook buttons. Sintra also uses behavioral data to monitor users' accounts, even if those accounts are registered under a different name. And you can see a shot here, screenshot provided to us of the Sintra platform. We blocked out the user's name in the interest of privacy, although you can see this individual's birth date and age, when they first started using Facebook, their last login, as well as all manner of trackings. How many different devices have they used to access Facebook? How many different accounts are associated with their name? What accounts have they visited? What photos have they tagged? And on and on and on. Mr. Zuckerberg, how many accounts in the United States have been subject to review and shut down through Sintra?
Senator, I do not know because I'm not actually familiar with the name of that tool. I'm sure that we have tools that help us with our platform and community integrity work, but I am not familiar with that name.
Do you have a tool that does exactly what I've described and that you can see here over my shoulder? Or are you saying that that doesn't exist?
Senator, I'm saying that I'm not familiar with it and that I'd be happy to follow up and get you and your team the information that you would like on this. But I'm limited in what I'm familiar with and can share today.
It's always amazing to me, Mr. Chairman, how many people before this committee suddenly develop amnesia. Maybe it is something about the air in the room. Let me ask you this. When a Facebook employee accesses a user's private information, like their private messages or their personally identifiable data, is a record made of that, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Sorry, Senator, can you repeat that?
Is a record made of any time a Facebook employee accesses a user's private information, personally identifiable information, for example, messages? Is a record made any time a Facebook employee does that?
Senator, I believe so.
Does it trigger an audit?
Senator, I think sometimes it may.
How many audits have been conducted?
Senator, I do not know the exact number of
audits. Can you give me a
list? Senator, we can follow up on that to see what would be useful here.
Will you, I'm almost finished, Mr. Chairman. Will you commit to giving us a list of the number of times Facebook employees have accessed users' personal account information without their knowledge? Yes or no?
Senator, we should follow up on what would be useful here. It is, of course, in the operations of the company, if someone reports something, sometimes necessary for people at the company to go review and understand the context around what is happening when someone reports something. So this is fairly frequent and is a matter of course. We do have security systems that can detect anomalous patterns to flag. But we should follow up in more detail on what you're interested in.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say in closing that what we have here is clear evidence of coordination between Twitter, Google, and Facebook. Mr. Zuckerberg knows he has the tools to track this, but he either doesn't remember or won't commit to letting us see it. We have evidence of Facebook tracking its own users all across the web. Mr. Zuckerberg won't answer questions about it, can't remember the name, isn't sure if the tool is deployed in this way, and won't commit to giving us basic information. I submit to you that this is both totally unacceptable and totally predictable, because it is exactly what these tech companies have done to the American people and to Congress for years now, which is why it is time we took action against these modern-day robber barons. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm, as you know, the lead Democrat on the antitrust subcommittee, and I'm going to take a little different approach here than Mr. Hawley did when it comes to competition policy, because I understand why they might be coordinating when it comes to security. What I want to focus on is what I think we're seeing all over this country, not just in tech. We're seeing a startup slump. We're seeing more and more consolidation. And throughout history, we've seen that that is not good for small businesses. It's not good for consumers. And it's not good for capitalism in the end. Even successful companies, even popular companies, and even innovative companies are subject to the antitrust laws of this country. When I asked Mr. Pichai about this at the Commerce Committee hearing a few weeks ago, he told me Google was happy to take feedback, and my response was that the Justice Department already provided feedback in the form of a federal antitrust complaint. And I know there is investigation reportedly going on out of the FTC right now regarding your company, Mr. Zuckerberg. So I want to start with exclusionary conduct regarding excluding smaller competitors by limiting interoperability with the Facebook platform. The investigation that we saw in the House recently gave us a number of examples of companies, excluded companies, including Vine, Stacklum, MessageMe, and Arc. And my view is this conduct, exclusionary conduct, not only damaged the ability of these smaller businesses to compete, but it deprived customers of convenient access. You're one of the most successful companies, biggest companies in the world, Mr. Zuckerberg, Facebook. Do you think that this is fair competition or not with regard to the interoperability and how you've conducted yourself with these other companies?
Senator, I'm generally strongly in favor of interoperability and building platform and API access for companies to be able to access. That's why we built the Facebook platform in 2007. Some of the policies that you mentioned, I think came about because what we were seeing was not necessarily startups, but larger competitors like Google and some of our Chinese rivals from trying to access our systems in order to use their scale to compete with us better. And it just felt to us like at the time that wasn't the intent of what we were trying to enable.
Okay, well, we may have a non-Chinese example here. I just want to know, I know that maybe we could hear from Mr. Dorsey, and I have concerns about Facebook's treatment of Twitter's subsidiary Vine. It's my understanding is that once Facebook recognized Vine as a competitor after Twitter acquired it in 2013, it cut off Vine's ability to interoperate with Facebook so that Vine users couldn't upload their videos to Facebook. And then I think that Twitter shut down Vine in 2016. Mr. Dorsey, could you tell me about the actual impact of Facebook's actions on Vine's business, on Vine's ability to compete, and on your decision to shut down the service? And I know you're not a Chinese company.
Well, I don't know about the intent on the other side, but I know our own experience was we found it extremely challenging to compete with Vine. And ultimately decided that the ball moved past us and we shut it down. Again, I don't know the specifics and the tactics and what was done, but we did find a very, very challenging market to enter, even though we existed prior to some of our peers doing the same thing.
Okay, I'm going to move to something else quickly. Instagram and WhatsApp. We have some released internal Facebook emails in which you, Mr. Zuckerberg, wrote that Instagram was nascent, and if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us. And in a later email, you confirmed that one of the purposes of Facebook acquiring Instagram would be to neutralize a competitor. You wrote those emails that were mentioned in that House report. Is that right, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, I believe so, and I've always distinguished between two things, though. One is that we had some competition with Instagram in the growing space of kind of camera apps and photo sharing apps. But at the time, I don't think we or anyone else viewed Instagram as a competitor, as a kind of large multi-purpose social platform. In fact, people at the time kind of mocked our acquisition because they thought that we dramatically spent more money than we should have to acquire something that was viewed as primarily a camera and photo sharing app at the time.
Okay, well,
So
and then here's
I
the
think it's
issue: is though
important to
we don't know how it would have done, and when we look at your emails, it kind of leads us down this road as well with WhatsApp. That part of the purchase of these nascent competitors is to, I'll use the words of FTC Chairman Joe Simons, who just said last week, a monopolist can squash a nascent competitor by buying it, not just by targeting it with anti-competitive activity. So I know that this is a subject of investigation. Maybe we'll be hearing something soon, but I think it's something the committee members better be aware of, not just with Facebook, but what's been going on with these deals that have gone through and how it's had led to more and more consolidation, and how we as the Senate, and I just talked to Chairman Graham about this last week, could actually do something about this by changing some of the standards in our laws to make it easier to bring these cases and not just involving tech. So I want to go to something here at the end, the political ad discussion we had in front of the Commerce Committee, Mr. Zuckerberg. I know you said that Facebook had made over $2 billion on political ads over the last few years. You said this was your, quote, relatively small part of your revenue. I know that, but it's a kind of a big part of the lives of politics when that much money is being spent on ads. This is a bill I actually have with Senator Graham. Yet we have seen these political ads that keep creeping through despite your efforts to police them on your own. And this is why I would so badly like to pass the Honest Ads Act. One ad that went through, it says, in 3 battleground states, ballots marked for Donald Trump had been discarded. Poll, will voter fraud only increase closer to November? So it stated in 3 battleground states, paid ad, ballots marked for Donald Trump have been discarded. This played between September 29th and October 7th, 2020, had up to 200,000 impressions. Does this ad violate Facebook's policy?
Sorry, can you repeat what the ad was?
The ad was an American Action News ad. They've advertised a lot on your platform, and it said in 3 battleground states, ballots marked for Donald Trump had been discarded. This was pre-election.
Senator, I don't know off the top of my head if that specific ad violates our policies. I'd be happy to follow up.
Okay, would you commit to a policy where actual people's eyes, people could review these ads instead of just being hit with algorithm review?
Senator, we do have review and verification of political advertisers before they can advertise.
Okay, so does every ad go through a human being? Like the
Senator,
TVs do?
I think our policy is that we want to verify the authenticity of anyone who's doing political or social issue advertising. And I think it's worth noting that our people reviewers are not in all cases always more accurate than the technical system.
So are you saying a human being reviews every ad? It's just really yes or no, or I don't know.
Senator, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Well, we'll follow up then in the written. And then you brought this cease and desist order against NYU for publishing a report that noting over the last 2 years, Facebook has not properly labeled approximately 37 million in political ads. Why would you not support this project? Why would you bring a cease and desist against them?
Senator, is that the project that was scraping the data in a way that might have been
that's your definition,
but it's the FTC consent decree that we have?
The reason it's happening is we haven't passed the Honest Ads Act, but so they're not violating privacy. They're trying to get the ads so people can see the ads, other campaigns, journalists, everyone.
Senator, you know that I support the Honest Ads Act and agree that we should have that passed, and even before that, that we've implemented it across our systems. But I think in the case that you're referring to, that project was scraping data in a way that we had agreed in our FTC consent decree around privacy that we would not allow. So we have to follow up on that and make sure that we take steps to stop that violation.
Okay, last, Mr. Dorsey, do you think there should be more transparency with algorithms? As part of this is not just, and I'm off of the ads now, I'm on just generically. Part of this is that people don't know how this data is going across the systems and across the platforms, and people basically are buying access, has been my impression, so that even if you say, like, what's the news in the last 24 hours, old stuff comes up, something's gone awry from the beginnings of this. Would it be helpful, do you think, if there was more transparency with algorithms?
I do think it would be helpful, but it's technically very, very challenging to enforce that. I think a better option is providing more choice to be able to turn off the algorithms or choose a different algorithm so that people can see how it affects one's experience.
Okay, thank you. And I ask that both of you look at the bill that Senator Kennedy and I have, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, to help the content providers negotiate with digital platforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining. Mr. Chairman, I know you've asked the question a couple of times about whether or not these platforms can be addictive. I think they probably can be, based on what I've read, and one of two ways. They could be just the nature of the personality and engagement in a tool that can that they can somehow relate to. But I also think there's a transactional addiction, and I think you also mentioned social dilemma. I think that's the use of analytics, which I don't criticize among the platforms, but it's the use of analytics to addict you to go down a certain path to produce a certain outcome. And that could either be an outcome forming an opinion, or an outcome buying something you didn't even think about 30 minutes before you started going down that path. So I think there are things that we've got to look at, and I do agree with Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey. It's not conclusive, but common sense would tell you it's a problem already, and it could become a bigger problem. Mr. Zuckerberg, I'd like to go back to the task platform for a minute. When I looked at the screenshot that Senator Hawley put up, it looked a lot like a work management tool. Can you tell me a little bit about that, and how many people are actually engaged as users on that platform at Facebook?
Senator, yes, thank you. I was a bit surprised by Senator Hawley's focus on our task system because all this is, it's a basic internal project management tool. It's exactly what the name sounds like. It's used by companies, by people across our company thousands of times a day to assign projects and track them. And it's used for all manner of different types of tasks across different people and teams.
And do you know roughly how many Facebook, either contractors or full-time employees, are actually users of the task platform?
I think that probably the majority of Facebook employees and people we work with have some interaction with the task system as part of some part of their work. It's basically just a company-wide to-do list.
The other platform that Senator Hawley mentioned was the Centra platform. You said you weren't familiar with that one, but I think that is something that would be helpful, maybe as a follow-up, to really understand the nature of that platform. I won't press you on it today because you said you weren't specifically familiar with the name of the tool, but I would be more interested in how it's used. But Mr. Dorsey, does Twitter have a platform similar to the task platform for work management communication among staff?
Absolutely. I mean, even the smallest companies use these tools. We use a tool called Jira.
Yep. I was involved in implementing these in my time in technology sector, so I could see why you have these platforms. But Mr. Zuckerberg, you mentioned you didn't think there was a systematic coordination between Google and Twitter, but you could conceive of how people in similar professions, may have a discussion, have a relationship, maybe talk about it over a beer. So could you see how the skeptic could see how these platforms could be used across platforms to force certain outcomes? Let's say you had 100 people at Facebook, 100 people at Twitter, and 100 people at Google that all had a political bent. They get together, they share notes, and then they go back and make decisions that could make it appear like it's a corporate initiative, but it could be an initiative by maybe some well-intentioned but misguided staff. Could you at least conceive of that being possible?
Senator, I understand the concern, and I think that coordination, specifically on writing the policies or enforcement decisions, could be problematic in the way that you're saying, which is why I really wanted to make sure that it was clear that what we do is share signals around potential harms that we're seeing, whether it's specific content in the aftermath of a terrorist attack that people are trying to share virally, so that way if one platform is seeing it, another platform can be prepared that it will probably see that content soon too. Signals around foreign interference in elections. But I think it's quite important that each company deals with those signals in the way that is in line with their own policies. And that, I think, is very different from saying that the companies are kind of coordinating to kind of figure out what the policy should be. I understand what the concern would be around that, and that's why I wanted to be clear about what we do and don't do there.
No, I agree with that. I would find it horribly irresponsible to think that this was some sort of a systematic approach across the platforms, but just with the sheer numbers of people that you all employ now, I could see how some of what's been suggested here in the hearing could actually occur with just small groups of people trying to manipulate certain outcomes. I don't want to get into details there, except to know that the task platform, if it's similar to ones that I have experience with, has a lot of logging, has a lot of data to where maybe you could do yourself a service by saying, I hear what's been suggested here, but in analyzing the interactions between groups of people and seeing maybe some aberrations, some people being more active and more geared towards one outcome or another, it could actually help you alleviate some of our concerns with the way these platforms are being manipulated. I'm not going to have time to drill down into some of the specific questions. I'm glad to hear that you all are open on some regulatory outcome. I will tell you, if you listen to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today, I fully expect that Congress is going to act in the next Congress, that we're going to produce an outcome. And some people think that that's not possible because that maybe the Republicans and Democrats are far apart. But if you listen to what they're asking you, they're concerned with a kind of outcome that they didn't like on social media in equal measure. So I do believe that you would be well served to come to the table as an industry and identify things. Mr. Zuckerberg, I like what you've said about transparency. And Mr. Dorsey, I do think that the algorithms, when you talk about the sheer scale, are probably the most sustainable way to go. But we're still going to have some confidence. I like your concept on choice as well. But we're going to have more visibility into what's occurred and what's produced certain outcomes. Like a Veterans Day post that I did after the election. It was actually after my opponent had conceded. I just posted a picture thanking veterans. And for a period of time, I think it was suspended and directing people towards election results. I would like to think, if that was a result of an algorithmic decision, that my opponent, who almost certainly posted a veterans ad, and every other person who was up for election got a similar treatment. Because if they didn't, it would seem to me that there was some other factor in play if these algorithms are being applied to the base of, in that case, political commentary from elected officials or candidates. So I view this hearing as an opportunity to seek your commitment on two things. One, I mentioned to you all yesterday, I've got a Intellectual Property Subcommittee hearing in the middle of December, I would like to have a Facebook and Twitter representative there. I know you're very different platforms, but I think you play very prominently in a hearing that Senator Coons, who's sitting across from me now, would like to have you represented. I think I can speak for Senator Coons that would be helpful, and we'd like to get your commitment to have witnesses for that hearing in the middle of December. Mr. Zuckerberg, can I get that commitment?
Senator, yes, we will make sure that we have the right subject matter expert to join your hearing.
Thank you. And Mr. Dorsey?
We'll follow up with determining the best course of action.
Thank you. And then we'll be following up on a series of questions that I'd like to ask that let me get my head around some of the analytics information that I think you almost certainly have, and hopefully be willing to share it. But we'll do that in a collaborative way in my office. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. We're going to take a 5-minute break. I think our witnesses have requested a break, and they certainly have earned it. And if that's okay with you, Senator Coons, we'll come back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Always, who breaks with the nicest people will always